Hi everyone, I think it's just Karen on now. My name is Morgan Menke, and I'm going to be your Zoom moderator for the 6th episode of the Wisconsin Idea series. This is our beta series in 2018. We'll be taking July and August off, but hopefully we're going to be back in September with new programs, a new round starting in the fall. There are 6 units at UW-Madison that take turns hosting this event series. This month our host is the Center for Integrated Ag Systems, and they were simultaneously hosting this larger conference in Madison that's titled Agroeco Prospect, the Politics of Integrating Values, Food, and Farming. It's a joint annual meeting of the Agriculture, Food, and Human Values Society and the Association for the Study of Food and Society. So our guest speaker today, Dr. Ricardo Salvador from the Union of Concerned Scientists, is going to be introduced by Michael Bell, the director of CIAS, in just a few moments. But while we're waiting for them to start, I just want to quickly explain our goal with the Food in Wisconsin Idea event series. It's pretty simple. Each month we tackle a topic related to food that we think would be relevant to the people of Wisconsin. Sometimes it's a UW professor or staff member, a group of students working directly with community members somewhere within the borders of the state, which is what the Wisconsin Idea is all about. And we're excited to continue the event series in the fall.
Yeah, I'm Mike Bell, along with Michelle Miller. We're co-program chairs of the conference. Michelle sitting there. Yeah, Michelle. Oh, me too, Michelle. Also, it's be good to have your, we'll extend your applause there to also include our sponsors who've made this possible. We mentioned them last night, but it's worth mentioning them again. Bloomsbury Academic, Organic Valley, the Food Studies Network, the Society for the Anthropology of Food and Nutrition, University of Wisconsin's Department of Community and Environmental Sociology, Boston University Metropolitan College Gastronomy Program, the Wisconsin Historical Society in association with Navistar International, and of course the UW-Madison Center for Integrated Agricultural Systems. Yeah, you can clap again, why not? Yeah. And all of you too. Also, before I introduce our speaker, I want to take note of a special significance of this day. Today, as many of you may know, is the final day of one of the world's largest food-related rituals. Actually, perhaps the largest, which is Ramadan, which ends at sundown today and is followed by the feast of Eid al-Fitr. Oh, thank you. Now I'm not feeding back so badly. So in acknowledgement of this, we are going to invite all of you to take a piece of baklava with you on the way out. You'll see it as you go out, to eat after sundown, as is traditional in many Muslim households. And along with that invitation, we will also ask you to, well, we do ask you to open your hearts to that greatest of human hopes, salam, shalom, peace. Right, now it's my pleasure to introduce Ricardo Salvador, our speaker. Ricardo, do you remember Iowa State back in the 1990s? That was when Ricardo was a professor of agronomy, researching how to make Zea corn, an even more beautiful crop by making it perennial once again. He was also teaching the nation's first course in sustainable agriculture, and we got into a little bit of mischief together, didn't we? Along with some other colleagues at Iowa State at the time, including Claire Hendricks, who's probably out here somewhere in the audience, but I can't see you because the lights are on here. And we together launched the nation's first graduate program in sustainable agriculture there. But Ricardo, he eventually outgrew academia, I think maybe because he was impatient about how to fit his passion for justice into the confines of agronomic research, or at least as we understood agronomic research at the time. He went off to Kellogg for a while and then moved on to the Union of Concerned Scientists, where he directs their food and environment program. And he's been getting into plenty more mischief there. Under his direction, UCS has become, I think, perhaps our leading public voice here in the US for the importance of an agroecological approach to food and agriculture. An agroecological approach that has justice at its core. One notable intervention was his co-authorship with Mark Bittman and Michael Pollan and Olivier de Schutter of a call for a national food policy, policy that's green, that's fair, that's nutritious, and affordable. And earlier this year, USC's Food Environment Program released a quite hard-hitting report. Maybe some of you have seen it. It's called Betrayal at the USDA, How the Trump Administration is Sidelining Science and Favoring Industry over farmers and the public. These are much needed kinds of mischief. So it is my great pleasure to ask you to help me welcome Ricardo Salvador.
Thank you very much, Michael, and I appreciate all of you coming out this evening. I just had to pick myself up from the terrace and walk over here, and that was a very difficult thing to accomplish. I also want to thank everybody on Michael's team and everybody associated with the conference that have made this evening possible. And I particularly need to single out Greg Lawless, who's sitting back there by the camera, because he's had to put up with a lot of nonsense over the tech this evening, and I really appreciate that. So because of the topic this evening, which is getting into why science is not neutral and it cannot be objective, it's particularly important that I actually explain to you the organization that Michael just described. My organization, the Union of Concerned Scientists, we were an organization that explicitly began to be political. So let me explain that first of all. And in the course of doing that, I may actually just completely do the talk in about 2 minutes. But UCS was born during the Vietnam era. And it was born on the campus of MIT and Harvard. And it was created by a combination of faculty and students who were very preoccupied by the fact that their science, many of them were nuclear physicists, was being used to create a great deal of human suffering and harm. And they did not believe that they'd gotten into the field of science to contribute to what the Department of Defense was doing with a lot of the knowledge that they were creating. And so they offered the government of the time the opportunity to work with them to come up with better approaches to deal with the conflict in Southeast Asia. And I want to quote for you just a couple of the 5 provisions that they articulated when they began the organization, including 2 Nobel physicists. After they stated the justification that I just summarized very crudely here, they said that they wanted UCS to be critical and to continually examine governmental policy in areas where science and technology are of actual and potential significance. And number 5, to me, is particularly important. They wanted to continue to explore the feasibility of organizing scientists and engineers so that their desire for a more humane and civilized world can be translated into effective political action. So you can see that the founders of the Union of Concerned Scientists explicitly believed that they needed to be political, and that's been our MO from that time. We say that we're devoted to the most important issues that humanity confronts. Our largest program at the moment has to do with stemming the tide of climate change, but we also work on how to feed, fuel, and transport the planet, because these are major consumers of fossil fuel, which contribute to climate change. So it's for this reason that I'm at the Union of Concerned Scientists, because we explicitly understand the political nature of the application of science, and we want to work on humanity's greatest problems. Now, if I do my job well here, if you're all not asleep within just a few minutes, when I'm done, you will want to also be political about your science, or maybe if you're not scientists, to be political, period. And you're fortunate because of the fact that having nothing to do with me, but with a number of my colleagues, it just so happens that next week on June the 20th, we're collaborating with a number of experts here. And so if you're interested in this, you would be able to work on the afternoon of the 20th with people such as whom you see here, Margaret Crome from the Michael Fields Agricultural Institute, George Reitstad of the Mayor's Office, and the communication specialist that you see listed there. The topic is going to be communication and advocacy in the agricultural science. sciences. So there'll be more information there about how to actually act on some of the concerns that I'm going to share with you from our organization. So now let me get into this notion of why science is inherently political and it cannot be objective. I think we live in a world that is so complex that it is difficult for us to understand most of those most threatening issues for humankind that I've just mentioned. And science is the pursuit of knowledge. Many of us do have the conceit that it's an objective pursuit of knowledge, but I want to distinguish between the epistemology that scientists are taught in order to determine that a fact exists in the universe, whether humans are around or not to know about that fact, and that other human beings can agree that that fact exists, the constants of the universe, physical constants, things of that sort, as opposed to the human endeavor that it is to decide what it is that you want to know, why you want to know it, who is asking the question, who's going to pay for that research, who's going to benefit from that research, who is going to be excluded from access to the fruits of that knowledge, and so on. Those are all eminently social questions. And of course, it shouldn't surprise us because science is inherently a human pursuit. And so it's subject to all human fallibilities and to human subjectivity. The fact that we want to know some things and not others is the prima facie evidence of that. And so that, in essence, is the argument that I want to develop. But the way that I want to develop it is specifically with respect to decisions that we've made in the agricultural sciences that have given us what appears to be only one path within agricultural and socioeconomic development, when in fact there are many others. And I want to end with a particular case of agroecology as a far better alternative to the system that we actually have been developing, and which at public universities, I assume many of you come from public universities, we have supported and many of us are complicit with. So part of the story here can be summarized by explaining to ourselves how it is that good people, for all the right reasons, can still do the wrong thing. So with that preamble, let me talk a little bit about this notion of the epistemology of science. This will be old hat. I just want to make sure that it's stated. You may doubt that I am familiar with science after some of the things that I'll say to you, and so I just want to make sure that I establish those credentials. So the epistemology or the protocols of science, as you know, are set up so that in theory, no matter where you ask a question, meaning it doesn't matter what part of the globe you're on, if you establish certain protocols that are replicable by other folks, they can discover exactly the same sort of thing. It doesn't depend on who the observer is, knowing the protocols, knowing what the question is. And we can agree on certain facts about the universe, which we can translate into technology. And the fruit of that technology is all around us. So that process works. So at the moment, we're making electrons jump through hoops in order to be able to look at the same images, and we all have more or less the same interpretation of the images that we're taking a look at. Now, let me jump to this question that I left you with 3 minutes ago. That epistemology is very different from the human endeavor of science. And the human endeavor is expressly a political, economic endeavor. You see a chamber not very far from us here where decisions are made about who gets what. And who makes those decisions is expressly a political decision. Policy inherently is the authority to channel resources to fulfill specific ends. And so this is a chamber where certain people will battle about those sorts of questions and that authority. Now, of course, the August University where we find ourselves, and every public university, also engages in the activity by advocating on behalf of their own interests. It's inherently a political activity. It's out in the open. Here's the webpage for government relations for the University of Wisconsin. And you can see the team, Chris Andrews, Jeff, somebody, sorry it's too blurry up here, and David Boardman, whom you can go see for your government relations needs. And there's probably rules at Wisconsin, like there's everybody else, about who gets to speak with these folks and how you carry the message there. But I just wanted to make sure that we all agree that this sort of struggle over who gets what and who gets to make the decision is something that's very real in the envelope of the science that we perform. In fact, it enables not only the science that we do, but what science we do, and that is inherently political. There's nothing objective about any of the activities that I've just described. And there are consequences. Let me name one of these consequences just at the general level of society that all of you are aware of. In fact, I would say that this is probably the key dynamic that explains the straits that we find ourselves in, not only as an American ostensive democracy, but on the planet as a whole, which is the growing economic inequality and segregation of human beings by race and class, which is creating a lot of dissatisfaction, particularly with norms that we all thought that we'd agreed to in the, again, ostensibly democratic world. So the reversal of that has to do with the fact that we tell stories that, in fact, don't play out in the real world, and we're noticing, and we are all collectively attempting to do something about that. So we are not divorced from this growing trend, and particularly within the realm of agriculture. Those of us that have been working at the public institutions, the land-grant universities that have developed today's industrial form of agriculture have actually contributed. And remember the litany that I mentioned earlier, good people for all the right reasons, still figuring out how to do the wrong thing, over the course of about 160 years have contributed to a situation where we have displaced farmers, denuded the wealth of rural communities, exploited nature, exploited people, concentrated wealth, and produced stuff that actually makes the majority of us sick. And that is not the stated intent of most people that are actually involved in this, which is a product of not being conscious of how we're contributing to the overall scientific system, which is the very point that I'd like for us to dwell on. Now, many of you who follow political economy may know of the French economist Frédéric Bastiat, but he described a time very similar to the one that we're experiencing at the moment, and summarized it in this way, that when plunder becomes a way of life for a group of men in society, let me insert here, you no longer need to board pirate ships and go see whom you can intercept and steal from. We actually set up legal institutions to perform the same function. So over the course of time, we create for ourselves a legal system that authorizes it and a moral code that glorifies it. So we have a name for such chambers this day. Here's the Congress of the nation. You have to be a millionaire to belong to this club. Now, I'll be repeating myself, and I apologize for that, but I want to make sure not to lose the connection among several of the claims that I'm making. There is a very subjective struggle for who gets what and who gets to decide. With our public resources, as the saying goes, we will kill some of you, and we will say you enjoyed it. And in this particular chamber, aside from having to be a millionaire to be a part of it, and by the way, you may wonder, that's just one of those statistical observations, you may wonder what the evidence is for a claim that seems to be as flagrant and certainly different from what we learned in our civics classes. So you may be familiar with some of the research that I'll show you, but I just want to support what I'm telling you. So here you see a tally of agribusiness lobbying from 1998 to the last full year that we have, 2017. You'll see that for the last two Farm Bill cycles, the one that is about to conclude right now and the 2014 Farm Bill cycle, on average, there's annual lobbying from the agribusiness sector to the tune of $136 million. It spikes up to about $155 million in a Farm Bill year. Now, this is how you buy your policies. There's this saying in DC that in order to get Congress to hear you, you have to either be the money or you need to be the many. Those are the two only ways that you can get attention out of that particular body. So here's the strategy of having the money. Now, there's a couple of things to observe about this trend. First of all, this sector is worth $1.8 trillion just in the United States. So lobbying to the tune of $234 million is one of the grandest bargains you can ever imagine. As a matter of fact, this has been quantified, and I want to tell you a little bit about that after I show you this other piece of research that, again, many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with, Gillens and Page from Princeton, where they basically conducted a study that I'm going to summarize this way. It really was complex, and if you're interested, I recommend the paper highly. But what they did was to take 21 years of policy decisions that the US Congress made, and then identify those decisions that could be mapped to a particular economic outcome for a given quintile of society. And when they did that, they came up with 1,800 policy decisions over 21 years about whom you could say this benefits one of 5 quintiles of society, and then plotted the chart that you see here, which essentially just tells you in plain English that the more a decision affects the wealthy, the more likely the Congress is to vote for it. And this is manifest in many different ways, but it further supports the case that I was making earlier on. Now, let's talk about the source of the money here. Here are the top lobbyists as organizations. Now, you should know that there's about 1,000 registered lobbyists for the agribusiness sector. If that doesn't mean anything to you, let me give you a reference point. The defense industry, one of the nation's most powerful lobbies, has 800 lobbyists. So the agribusiness sector has slightly a little bit more, and they are able to leverage the public investment in the so-called Farm Bill in order to benefit their business interests. We'll come back and talk about this in greater detail. Now, when talking about the amounts here, remember that I mentioned 234 million annually is the average. Plus or minus, the standard deviation is 9 million, which is about what each one of the top 3 would give. As you know, if you've been following developments in the agricultural world, the top 2 are going to soon disappear from this list. It'll be interesting how they reconfigure, but the third one, very, very influential, then likely by default, will move up to the first one, and they're lobbying at the tune of about $10 million a year. Now let's talk about the return, which I mentioned that we'd come back to, and I want to give you a basis for comparison. The basis for comparison is what you would do if I told you that you could make an investment that would guarantee you a return of 11% on the stock market. It would tell me a little bit about your moral character, what you would do with that information, but let's suppose that I would tell you that. You would consider these days, with current market conditions, that's a pretty good investment. Most of you would accept that kind of return for your investment, 11 cents to the dollar. Now, let's take a look at what happens with the oil industry. The oil industry gets back $59 for every $1 in lobbying that they invest. You can see that it really pays. That's 5,900% return on their investment. Let's compare the return on investment for the agribusiness sector and the whole explanation for how they do it. So this is just the Farm Bill. There are more returns to the agribusiness investment than just the Farm Bill, but if you just restrict yourself to something easily measurable, which is a $1 trillion program over a span of 10 years, the way the Congressional Budget Office scores it, then the return to investment is 14,400% for the agribusiness sector. And here there's a very interesting quandary. The return to each one of the companies that you saw listed, and those are just the top, but the return to each one of the companies for the pittance millions that they invest for lobbying is so great that, of course, it's no wonder that they do it. And as I've said, it really pays for them. Here's this quandary. That is a very high benefit that's concentrated in a very small number of people and corporations. Whereas the majority of us probably wouldn't believe, with the exception of folks that would come to an address like this on a fine evening instead of being out on the terrace, that there's anything wrong with the food system, much less that something needs to be done about it. And so if you quantify what the cost to us in terms of the tax dollars that we pay of the Farm Bill is, it's about $1.72 a day. It's about $624 for each of us taxpayers a year. We don't even feel that cost. So it's the typical quandary of a cost that's distributed broadly, it's diffuse, but the benefit is highly concentrated. And so there are very small numbers of people and corporations that are highly motivated to pursue that kind of return, whereas the rest of us will have ice cream on the terrace. So it leads to a particular structure of agriculture. Now, this may seem like it is a dated paper. I'm very specifically going back to this paper, which many of you in the room surely will be familiar with. It was authored by Stu Smith, economist from Maine. At the time, he was serving with the Joint Economic Committee of Congress, and he was asked to perform a study to determine what the trend was of distribution of the food dollar. This has grown now in its entire website and application over at the USDA, at the Economic Research Service website, so you can go see a much more sophisticated development of the idea. But he took a century's worth of data and essentially plotted the table that I want you to take a look at very carefully here, because he predicted some things, and it's the contrast between his prediction and actuality that makes me go back and fetch it from the time that he did this back in the late 80s to the present. So let's concentrate on his first figure here. So the three sectors in the structure of agriculture are the input sector. They sell you the seeds, the machinery, the chemicals that you need. The marketing sector, which buys from farmers and converts all of that stuff into what they call edible bites. So in the sector in between are the entrepreneurs that go outside and do production. Now, the way that we've developed this activity, they buy somebody else's intelligence, apply it in the field, and then sell undifferentiated products, I'm speaking generally about the commodity markets here, into that market sector. And over time, the economic contribution of what they do had been decreasing to the point where, in essence, economists agreed they were essentially just fancy laborers, and therefore the return to their investment was labor. A labor wage. And remember what I said here, buying somebody else's intelligence is what the economist would say about this. So the prediction that Stu Smith made, he actually elaborated in figure number 2 from this paper. You can see sort of the trend there. He predicted that by now, 2020, farming would no longer exist. And you might think, well, that makes absolutely no sense. We'll have to continue to eat, so somebody has to continue to produce. What he meant was, you could see how there was growing concentration on both sides of the equation. Monopsonies on one side, monopolies on the other side, farmers being squeezed out. Why wouldn't there be vertical integration on the input sector, the production sector, and the marketing sector? So he predicted eventually that would happen. And in fact, there's a model of agriculture in which that actually has happened. I'll let you stew on that a little bit while showing you with the red bar here the actual data, and you can see that's a regression, so it's nicely cleaned up for all the variation there, and then there's the extrapolation in the green line. So he would predict that by now there would be no farmers. Now, in fact, we almost have no farmers. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit, but we do have farmers still. But the version of this that actually did come true is exemplified by contracts like this, in which you literally just have laborers who are told what species of poultry to buy, or what species of hog to buy, what temperature the hog house or the chicken house should be, when you should start feeding, what rations you're feeding, what temperature and moisture regime should change like as the livestock develop, when you should, quote, harvest them, and so on. Essentially, they are just the labor of the enterprise. And they sign on to contracts like this as a way to make sure that they stay out on the land, because we've squeezed out all of the economic value that we're willing to pay for the activities that they discharge. Now, I'm using very orthodox economic analysis here, basically just to lay out what Stu Smith explained. Now, let's go back to this and explain something about why that hasn't happened. This is my theory. You can agree whether you come along with this theory or not. There's a very explicit reason why that will never converge to zero farmers, and why what we'll do is explore how few farmers we need. And that reason is that when you go to produce, you will need inputs. So if there's a tornado, if there's a flood, if in a 30-second hailstorm you lose all of the investment that you made in the seeds, the herbicides, everything that you purchased in order to produce, if you lose all of that, there's no such thing as going to the input sector and say, sorry, I had a disaster, I need my money back. So that doesn't happen. The input sector has sold. The marketing sector has 7 basins, just like the Midwest. Midwesterners are justifiably very proud of the basin that they've created here for large-scale commodity production. There's 6 more just like that. Literally, I could put a bandana over your eyes, drop you in the middle of one of them. It would take you minutes to figure out you're not in the middle of Wisconsin or Iowa or Illinois and many of these places around the planet. 7 basins like that. And there is profit in actually controlling those markets at the global level rather than just playing a national game. And the large agribusinesses play that game. They're more powerful than governments. They can leverage the employment and the investment that they can make to exercise that power. But somebody still has to go outdoors and take the biggest risk in the entire enterprise of losing all of the investment, and industry is not going to take that risk. You and I are going to take that risk. So we'll guarantee the farmers that are going to do this that no matter what happens to markets, and no matter what happens with weather, we'll make them whole. Now, further realized that the way that we do that is through direct subsidies to producers, and that money doesn't stay with them. We'll hear a little bit more about that in just a little bit. That money goes straight through to buy those inputs, and the value of the high production and the low value, in many cases below cost of production value of what is being produced, that surplus, is actually cashed in by the marketing sector. So it's a beautiful system for the marketing sector and the input sector. And that's ultimately what we're supporting, both with our science and with our public policy around agriculture. Now, I've been saying repeatedly that we've learned a little bit more about the structure of agriculture. I'm going to call in some help in order to explain this. I'm going to call in the assistance of the former Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack, to explain this to us in about a couple of minutes.
I hope that folks would understand the situation of the American farmer. And I don't expect you necessarily to be totally sympathetic, but I want you to know who these people are. You know, for the most part, there are about 2.2, 2.3 million people that are characterized or qualify as farmers under our survey at USDA. It only takes the ability to raise about $1,000 of product for sale to be a quote-unquote farmer. About 1.3 million of that 2.2, 2.3 million are folks who are doing something in the back of their home out in a rural area. They may be growing some strawberries. They may be growing some apples that they turn into cider, and every year they take it down to the farmer's market for a couple months. They sell a couple $1,000 worth of stuff, and it's a good thing that's taking place. But they're not making any money off this. They're just doing it because they enjoy doing it. So that leaves about 1 million people that we, if you went out and talked to the person on the street, would ask, you know, define for me a family farmer. They're probably talking about these people that do farming, if you will, for a living. Of that number, about 700,000 of that number are small to medium-sized operators who sell less than $250,000 worth of product. In the best times we've had in agriculture, in the last 6 or 7 years, record exports, in some years, record income. These folks averaged about $10,000 from their farming operation. $10,000. Which means that the vast majority of that 700,000 folks, they are working on the farm, they're working off the farm, and their spouse is working on the farm and off the farm. They struggle, but they love the land, they're connected to the land, and they want to stay in the land, and we want to help them. And then you've got the other 200,000 to 300,000 that are commercial-sized operations, and you know, they're doing pretty well.
Here are the data that the Secretary was referring to. So we're going to be seeing percentage of farms and percentage of acres. And here's what the distribution looks for percentage of farms. And what you see along the x-axis there is the size of farm, largest over to the right. You see that there's a relatively small number, which you would call large farms, 500 acres and above. And here is the way that the acres are distributed. And so one of the things that you could notice is that if you look at just the right three couples of columns over there, about 11% of the nation's farmers control 70% of the nation's farmland. One of the ways in which about 20% of the nation's farmers produce about 2/3 of the nation's agricultural output, which I name very deliberately that way because not all of it is food, it's agricultural output. You may know several different versions of this, but another very interesting factor while we're looking at this distribution of the structure of agriculture is about 20% of these farmers, and so you can take a look at the first four couplets of columns there. 20% of the nation's farmers collect 80% of the subsidies that we provide to keep the input and marketing sector profitable. That's the way that it really should be stated rather than keeping farmers on the land if you agree with the theory that I just laid out for you. Now, how do we come to create a system like this? Who designed something as grandiose as this? Because if you were Machiavellian enough to create something like this, you deserve some sort of prize. So let's take a quick review of this, and this will mostly be a reconstruction or a reinterpretation of what you might call the land-grant university, or maybe even the big agriculture doxology. So land-grant universities prepare all of us, whether we end up in industry or not. We're cohorts, we know each other across the advocacy sector and the faculties of universities and in industry. So we all receive the same mother's milk at land-grant universities, and so this is a reinterpretation of it, or maybe looking in sort of the side window. So it didn't used to be this way. Production really did used to limit. The way that you would increase production prior to the Second World War, to grab one reference point, would be to increase the amount of land under production, extensification. And it was very difficult work. It was gendered work. It was hardship. And you can imagine folks that were at the pointy end of an implement like this, thinking every hour that they were doing this, that there had to be a better way. And so there did happen to be an individual who did that for a number of years during his childhood and teenage years, who eventually got into a position where he could do something about that. And boy, did he do things about that. And so let me just enumerate a few of the things that he did. You are familiar with the fact that during the height of the Civil War, he had a few other things on his mind. He created the Department of Agriculture. Prior to that, what passed for the Department of Agriculture was in the patent office. It literally was an archive of seeds that farmers exchanged from different parts of the world. And so there was an official Department of Agriculture set up. And in that same year, the Morrill Act was passed that created institutions like this, authorized institutions like this. And at the same time, Lincoln created the National Academy of Sciences. I wonder what he would think now of the mission that he gave the National Academy of Sciences, which is to provide the Congress objective scientific information for them to make the best decisions for the nation. So these are the things that Lincoln got started, and as a result of that, a series of consequences ensued. So one of the things that occurred was that oil was discovered pretty much around that same time, which allowed us to overcome certain thermodynamic limitations. Lincoln also signed the Transcontinental Railroad Act, which eliminated distance, so to speak. There was mechanization of agricultural implements, first steam-driven and then by fossil fuels. Then refrigerated railroad cars were implemented. It allowed us to preserve food over great distances. That turned the Midwest into the larder for the both coasts. And then we improved seeds in a number of different ways. Hybrid corn is one of the best examples. And then technology that was developed during the Second World War, namely fertilizer technology, and in the First World War, literally chemical warfare technology was converted for peacetime uses as fertilizer and agricultural chemicals. And eventually that led, when it all converged, into unimaginable productivity as a result of the science that was conducted at situations like this. You must remember that in 1862, we didn't understand how plants worked. You couldn't explain that there was such a thing as photosynthesis. You couldn't explain that there was ruminant metabolism. I mean, we had observations about all of these things, but we didn't have the science that allowed us to exquisitely manipulate those particular systems in a reductionist fashion. And so the result was this, which stands for the dramatic success of this approach to agriculture. But it had severe consequences, some of which we've enumerated already. And so you're, again, familiar with this. A lot of these things we've all seen. I'm just recasting how they all fit into a larger interpretation. Let me go back to this. So you can see that the number of farms peaked at around 7 million just prior to the Second World War. And as you know, land and farms has been relatively steady, but as the Secretary just explained to us, you've seen this plummeting of farms to a level of about 2 million. Now, you've learned directly from the Secretary on interpreting the ERS data, we're down to 1 million farms. You'll hear people talk about 2.3 million farms with, losses in the thousands every year. 1 million operating farms, out of which about 300,000 are producing the majority of agricultural output and the majority of actual profit. Everybody else has to subsidize their income in order to stay on the land. In other words, they have completely different motivations for staying on the land. That's an important thing to remember about this. And also, I'll just, since this plot is up here, just say that the brown line is very misleading, but that's the average farm size according to the amount of land that is actually owned, not the amount of land that is actually farmed. And since nationally the average is about 50% rental, then you can see the distortions that exist there as well. But now let's go back to this and now cast another look at the interpretation here as a result of that very quick summary of the knowledge that has been developed and the ends that it has served. And remember the litany that I mentioned at the outset. So what it has done is to displace farmers. What it has done is to impoverish rural communities. It exploited nature, exploited people, and mostly produces food that makes all of us sick. Obese at the very least, but diabetic, and the #1 killer of Americans is cardiac diseases due to the way in which we overeat all the wrong stuff, which is cheap to do because of this highly subsidized system. So let me continue making the point about how science is not neutral in any of this and take a slightly different tack, but hopefully confirm the argument that I'm building for you. I want to talk to you about what agriculture really is. Michael described to you that I'm an agronomist. I'm proudly an agronomist and taught for nearly 30 years, several generations of folks farming in Iowa now. And I can tell you that what I'm about to describe to you, sadly, is not the understanding of what agriculture is, even of professionals. So I'll give you in just about 3 minutes an actual description of what agriculture really is and save you 4 years of an agronomy curriculum, which I wouldn't wish on anybody. So we learn to perform agriculture in settings like this. It's a river delta. This is a place where natural hydrological forces sweep vast watersheds of sediment and organic matter and detritus, which is fertilizer. And concentrated when that water flows to the next largest body of water and slows down and deposits that sedimentary load with all of that fertilizer value. Folks that developed agriculture originally observed that these were naturally fertile areas, and we began the practice of agriculture in such places. Another place where exactly the same dynamic was occurring was in places like this, alluvial fans. This is in the Coachella Valley in Southern California, and I love this picture for a number of different reasons. You can visually see how hydrological forces are actually moving parts of that large landscape and concentrating it in the alluvial fan. And those are the places where we began to perform agriculture. This is runoff agriculture, by the way. It's still the dominant form of agriculture all over the planet. I want to make an observation about this that I'll come back to when we talk about agroecology, an approach much better than the one that I've just been rehearsing for you. And it is this is a natural geological process. It is happening whether human beings are around or not. And if you ask the sustainability question about this kind of a system, first of all, you have to put a human being into it in order for that question to even make sense. But if you have an agriculturalist taking advantage of this flow of materials, and in order to value what this means, just imagine either using buckets or even modern mechanized equipment to perform all of the labor that it takes to transport all of that material from that large geological area and concentrate it there in such a fine distribution that it actually has just the right drainage in order for us to perform agriculture there. So, and by the way, you see that even today, agriculture in the Coachella Valley is performed down at the bottom of that alluvial fan. You see the irrigation canal and the road that goes down at the bottom of that alluvial fan. I'll just, out of curiosity, I have to go quickly here and I don't want to waste your time, but I'm just curious. Anybody here from Mexico? Oh, I see one hand. There may be more, but so in our home country, you may know that there are any number of places sprinkled all over Mexico that are known by the name Atepec. Now, the reason why I think all of you should be interested in this is that that comes from the language of folks that created a short little empire. They were very latecomers in the history of Mexico that you would know as Aztecs. They were around for just a couple hundred years, built up an empire before a bigger empire came from across the Atlantic and smashed them. But the result is that their language dominates a lot of the place names throughout central and southern Mexico. And their name for a place that's good for a settlement, in other words, the name for a town is Altepetl. Altepetl means water flowing from a mountain. You know, in other words, it's the recognition of the fact this is where we can settle. We have everything that we need here in order to grow our crops and to establish our village. The Hispanicized version of Altepetl is the horrendous Atepec, but that's why you have that all over the place in southern Mexico. And all over the world, this is the dominant form of agriculture still. But coming back to this point, if you ask the sustainability question, the answer to this is a sustainability question. It's not sophisticated. How long can this go on? Well, it can go on as long as you have that area that you're wearing down and the geological processes occur at the rate that have created this particular alluvial fan. All that human beings farming in that alluvial fan do is to insert themselves in the middle of something that is happening anyway in such a way that they don't interrupt that particular geological and hydrological cycle. Okay, so let's leave that aside and we'll come back to it. By the way, here's an example of a Hopi field today that utilizes exactly the same sort of principle at the bottom of an alluvial fan to produce our right beautiful crop of corn. Okay, here's a modern crop of corn. This is up in the northwestern corner of Colorado, which I've chosen specifically so that it features irrigation. So here's what we've done with the modern industrial system as a result of all of the science that all of us are complicit with. What we've done is not look for a nice alluvial fan up on the side of a mountain or a nice river delta someplace. As a matter of fact, the definition of an agriculturist is we don't believe in natural carrying capacity. Agriculturists, by definition, overcome the so-called ecological carrying capacity. But it's not because we're magicians. You know, there's no particular insight about thermodynamics that agriculturists are performing. Fossil fuel allows us to cheat. It's a specific feature of industrial farming that allows us to spend more energy than the food that we produce returns to us, that allows us to permit with this very peculiar form of agriculture. So what we do is create our own virtual alluvial fans. So for us, it looks like this. So there are staging areas, and I've described to you 6 basins like this besides the United States all over the planet. And you may be curious, you can name most of them, you know, so there's the Midwest, it's the Cerrado down in southwestern Brazil, there's the Pampas down in Argentina, there's a vast area of Central Europe, Ukraine, South Africa, Australia, northwestern China, and so on. Every bit is productive, all of them overproducing, all of them having problems with surplus and low prices. And remember the sector that benefits from all of this. So this is what we've done. We overproduce. It's a phenomenon that you can easily understand as taking plenty and making scarcity out of it. And so you asked the sustainability question about that system, and the answer is, well, that can go on as long as there's a big hole like this. This particular one is on the eastern border of Arizona, where we can dig out the potash, or as long as there's a big hole like this one, and this particular one, like most holes like this one where we get our potash for industrial agriculture, is in Benin, out in Western Africa. So that's how long this can go. And by the way, the answer to this question, you realize there will be a range of estimates, and even though down at the bottom of the oceans and the seafloor, there are essentially infinite supplies of this stuff, up where we can actually easily excavate it, there's only a supply of about 80 to about 320 years of both of these combined. So that's the answer to the sustainability question for 2 of the major macronutrients that are required to produce in the way that I've just described. And the single most used macronutrient is one that you're breathing in big gulps at this moment because it makes 80% of the atmosphere, but it's very non-reactive. It's doing absolutely nothing to you. I won't tell you what you do with it, you can imagine, but you're taking in big gulps of it. However, we fix it industrially and essentially are mining the universe, or the atmosphere, for that nitrogen. We mine 40% of the atmosphere's nitrogen in order to sustain human activities, primarily agriculture, according to latest estimates. And in order to do that, we need to perform a feat of magic by industrial processes that, curiously, certain bacteria know how to do at room temperature. They need to exclude oxygen, and they kind of make deals with plants to feed them sugar in order to do this. For some reason we don't understand. They're leguminous species. They produce dry seed inside of a pod. Don't really understand why it's only that family that has learned how to do this really well. Although we've caught many other families that are sort of with their pants down, evolving a similar partnership with soil bacteria in order to do this. The thing is, they can do it in an energetically favorable way under standard, what a scientist would call ambient temperature and pressure. For us to be able to do exactly the same thing, we need to create 100 times atmospheric pressure, 400 times atmospheric temperature. And then through a process known as Haber-Bosch, we can fix 40% of the atmosphere's nitrogen into our fertilizers. Now, the result of that, and one of the reasons why we're all complicit, not just as scientists, is this works really well for us. It's a really nice system that most of us enjoy, because what it means is that, you know, we can basically wish for whatever we want, whether we go someplace where somebody provides everything that we need, even cleans up after us when we're done, or we go someplace where we can select from 60,000 different pre-assembled ingredients that with about another 10 to 20 minutes we can have after thinking that we want to have it. And it can come from wherever in the world you want. So whatever it is that you wish, even here in Madison, Wisconsin, in the middle of the continent, you can decide that you want Alaskan salmon. You can decide that you want to have the finest Thai. You can decide that you want Mexican. Whatever it is that you want, within a few seconds of having thought of it, within a few minutes, you can have it. And that is because there's a complex system of logistics, again, very fossil fuel dependent, that spans the entire globe, that will make sure that no matter what it is that you want, when you walk into the restaurant thinking of that, it's as good as the Star Trek replicator. It'll pop up in front of you within just a few minutes. By the way, I can't resist saying, even though it's not the topic of this talk, that's an explanation for why there's so much waste in the industrial system. It's not an accident. It's not an oversight. It's a feature of the system, because you may or may not want it. It has to be there whether you want it or not. Don't pay attention to all the just-in-time logistics that you read about to calibrate that. Finally, waste is finely tuned into this because the actual value of the food in the system is nil. It's negligible. The service is what gives you the profit when you're in this particular industry. So we waste the food willingly. Now, let me give you an example of this. In order to do this, you're familiar with this. I think it just needs to be shown as one full picture here. Here's, you know, almost a commercial for one of these value chains for food. Now, in order to put this thing together, you're all familiar with a cartoon that looks something like this. So it begins, first of all, with the production sector, which then feeds into the primary and secondary processing sector, which then feeds into the manufacturing and distribution sector. And then finally, up at the top of that are us just walking in someplace and saying, I want spaghetti, and there will be spaghetti there. Now, I ask you to point out to me, where is the farmer here? While you look for the farmer, let me tell you that this diagram came from General Mills. So it's the General Mills view of the food system. Where's the farmer? There's the farmer. Agricultural commodities. When you open up a box of cereal from General Mills, from the Kellogg Cereal Company, from any of one of these companies, as proof of what I just told you about where the value in the system is, that box may cost you $4 to $5.50. And the value of the cereal in that box is about 4 cents. And everything else is the packaging, the transportation, paying for the real estate rights in grocery stores, because you know that's the way that they work, to place it right at eyes view or an exhibit as you come into the store, and then paying for the ads and placing the Facebook messages that put the idea in your head, you want the General Mills cereal. Now, nobody's getting away with a thing. That's where the value is. We all want edible bites. What the system is selling us is the convenience, and it's saving us time. And the food is incidental to this thing. I mean, it comes along for the ride, but we're saving time. That's what this industry is providing for us. And we've enabled all of that. The cost to attrition in terms of farmers, in terms of denuding the land, rural economies, everything, the litany that I just described to you, that is inconsequential, because look how efficient this is. And speaking of efficiency, I actually think this is one of the most beautiful sites in the world, but it's, I can be critical of it as well. I mentioned earlier the theme of taking plenty and making scarcity out of it, and here's one of the best examples of that. Now, I personally, and my colleague from Mexico, whoever it was that raised their hand, and actually most of the Midwestern economy would not be here had it not been for the domestication of this species about 7,000 years ago. That's a different talk. But what you see here is a biological hot rod. It really has been tremendously productive compared to what the original perennial species is still doing in the mountains of southwestern Mexico on dry sides of mountains. This is a hot rod in many different ways. There would be about 35,000 of these on a given acre. Notice the architecture with leaves that are erect up at the top to let more light filter into the middle of the canopy. During the phase at which this picture was taken, which agronomists refer to as the packing phase or the linear phase, this thing is putting on about 1/4 of a ton of dry matter into ears every day. That is a result of a lot of reductionist science and not a whole lot of systems thinking, particularly very little socioeconomic thinking. But I want to tell you it's not a particularly efficient system for a number of different reasons. By the way, I should actually tell you the punchline of that agronomy lesson. The agronomy lesson was done a while ago. You may not have realized it. So I forgot that I need to give you the punchline. What agriculture really is securing the supply lines of the basic factors of production for it. You need land, you need water, you need nutrients, and in the modern version, you need the fossil fuel that makes the whole thing go. So when you figure out where the best land is and take the appropriate political and military measures to acquire that land, same argument for the water, same argument for the nutrients, same argument for the fossil fuel, that's a political economic action, if not a downright military action, as it was in the Midwest. When I taught at Iowa State University, as Michael described to you, I had fine, salt of the earth, heart of gold, young people look at me earnestly in the eye and say words like this: we are so fortunate, God has looked after us, we are blessed to have this land. And I won't discuss God's role in this, I'm not qualified to talk about her, but I'll just tell you, I know very explicit decisions that were taken just a few generations ago that determine who has this land at this moment and who is producing on this land. And so, downright military actions. Well, there's an aseptic view of the specialization that led to the productivity that may seem grand for that crop in the background that I've just described. Here's how very well-educated agronomists would describe to you. They would say there's an efficiency ratio. It is yield. It is everything. It's an efficiency ratio because you put into the numerator how much dry matter you're accumulating per, and the denominator, the cost, the amount of land. That's the efficiency ratio. How much can you produce per amount of land? And how can you maximize that? That's the doxology. Well, the most limiting factor is how much radiant energy there is to drive photosynthesis. That's the flux of photons. That's Q. And then you have to intercept as much of that as possible. That's the canopy that you see behind you. You need to make sure, as any good agronomist will tell you, not a single photon of light should reach the soil. It should all be intercepted by green foliage and drive photosynthesis. And then there's an efficiency measure, which actually is complex. It's lots of different processes that determine how much of that light actually fixes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and turns it into first simple acids that then eventually become proteins, oils, carbohydrates, cellulose, everything that makes up the plant. And then ultimately, you have to distribute that in the plant. This is the harvest index. Ideally, you could use the root, the stem, the leaves, the grain, in the case of pulses, the seeds. That would be a 100% harvest index. But in the case of the crop that you see back there, the harvest index would be 25% when you take into account all of the biomass that this produces, root and the aerial matter. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about why this is one of the dumbest ways you could set up a canopy. And the reason is that you can see in the picture behind you, most of the light is quenched by the time that you get to the middle of the canopy. I keep telling you that there's lots of different talks that we could divert to here, and be very disciplined about this. This particular equation that you see here actually describes how the light is quenched according to depth within the canopy, and a concept that's called the leaf area index. You can think of it as the number of stories in a canopy. So on a single acre of corn like this, you could have 6 acres of leaves, so leaf area index would be 6. And so you multiply the total area, which is actually performing photosynthesis. But the bottom leaves are actually not very efficient. They begin to do something that's called firing, and it actually gives you an equilibrium point where you can see those leaves are no longer paying for themselves energetically, so the crop jettisons them. There's a much better way of designing something that doesn't create scarcity out of plenty in lots of different ways. But because I know a lot of this may sound sacrilegious, particularly if you are a serious agronomy student, I don't mean, or an agricultural science student, I don't mean to disrespect anyone's motivations or their knowledge in this field. But let me just demonstrate to you how that efficiency ratio of yield is all kinds of wrong. We could keep on going a long time with that particular determination of what we value and therefore what we pursue. So one example that I'll give you is this. This is research conducted by Emily Cassidy. And what she asked was the following: what if instead of asking how many bushels per acre or how much dry matter per acre can we produce, we instead ask how many people are we feeding per acre or per unit of land? In general, the efficiency ratio should be in the numerator the things that we want, divided by in the denominator the actual cost. And in that simple efficiency ratio of yield, we are cheating, because we're not putting all of the costs into that denominator. And so here's what she determined. She said, if you actually just looked at the number of calories produced, look at the legend down on the x-axis, you would see pretty much what you would predict. The United States is a titan globally. It's where we learn to perform industrial agriculture and teaching the rest of the world. Everybody's falling all over themselves to try to imitate that system. Followed by China, Brazil, there's the world average, and then there's India. But when you actually calibrate this to say how much of that is actually getting to people, so look at the x-axis, now it's calories delivered. Now in terms of calories delivered, China is actually the country that does the best in terms of taking calories that are produced and delivering them as food to people. And another way of looking at this is in this particular chart, which is asking what is the efficiency of that particular process. You can see that the world average is at 59. You can see that the United States doesn't even reach the world average, and that instead it's India and China that are the world's leading superpowers when it comes to delivering calories of food per unit of land. So it's a different way of looking at exactly the same data, but valuing different things about the agricultural system. Just the very beginning of rethinking how we should perform agriculture. Here's another way. This is a very dated slide. You can tell by the style, but I'm keeping it mostly because it does date to research that we did when I was at Iowa State. And yield deflation refers to that concept that I just described of constructing a more accurate efficiency ratio in the following way. You know, it is really unfair, impartial, to compare different values of agricultural systems by the yield that they produce. We just saw one example of that. Those systems in China and India look pretty bad when you're just looking at the total amount of tonnage that is being generated per unit of land. When you value different things, you come up with different observations. Now, think about this. That unit of land is not the source of all of the resources that should be in the denominator to calculate the efficiency ratio of yield. You remember those figures that we saw of everything that's required? You're measuring the amount of dry matter that you produce on a single unit area of land, but you had to bring, in the case of Colorado, water from outside of that area. So you all know that over 3/4 of the freshwater supplies, surface freshwater supplies on the planet are used for agriculture. So you have to bring water to that acre of land. It was not original to that acre of land. And you have to bring the nitrogen, and you have to bring the phosphorus, and you have to bring the potassium. And if you're using embodied energy in the form of machinery and seeds and chemicals, you have to account for that. And furthermore, when you apply all of that stuff, you actually destroy nature because the effluent from that pollutes water and it pollutes the environment and so on. What if you tried to actually account for all of that in the denominator where it should go? So that's the research that we did. So a student of mine by the name of Garth Kelly did this research. And I want to show you what he did. He took what at that time, he performed this research in the early 90s. He took what at that time was the nominal yield of these two crops, 138 bushels to the acre for corn, 146 for soybeans. But then by putting all of the costs into the denominator that I just described for the state of Iowa, for the entire state of Iowa, where corn and soy is being produced, he came up with what we called the calibrated yield, the deflated yields that accounted for the actual ecological footprint of this style of agriculture. Whereas when you did that, it would decrease the actual productivity to as if you were only producing 105 bushels of corn and as if you were producing only 35 bushels of soybean. Now, the whole reason for demonstrating that to you is just to show you one of the applications. There are lots of applications here. So this is one. And here, what I want to walk you through is the same sort of study. This was done on the farm of a gentleman by the name of Doug Allert in north central Iowa. So we were very lucky to find him because he farmed both industrially and organically. So this was a working farm, the same management skills, same soils, same environmental regime, and we could compare industrial versus organic production. So there's the nominal yields. And by the way, there's a third column over there because that was Doug Allert's rotation, which he applied for organic production. So there you see the nominal yields for those two crops. Now compare the deflated yields there. That's how maize did and soybean did when you actually took into account all the resources that had to be brought in from outside. Now if you're wondering how that deflation occurs, this is just so that you know this isn't magic. You can translate all of those other factors that should be into the denominator into the amount of land that's required for that amount of energy or that amount of water, the amount of eroded soil, and so on. So you sum all of those up, put them in the denominator, and that's how you get to this deflated yield. But now here's the interesting application. Compare that to organic production. So here's the nominal organic production, which you see really is comparable for both corn and soybean, but then deflated because organic production also has its costs. You know, at that time, this was before Roundup Ready crops, you still did a lot more mechanical tillage as organic production still does. And so you have to deflate for that as well. So the comparison, though, is in those two brownish columns. Notice that in the organic method, you have 106 bushels of deflated yield against the deflated industrial production of 82 bushels, and not as dramatic, but a similar trend for the first year of soybean, where we can make a comparison, 33 versus 28. Now, why am I dragging you through all of this? Remember that litany of socioeconomic questions that I asked? What do you want to know? Why do you want to know it? Who's going to pay for it? Who's going to benefit from it? Who's going to be excluded from the benefits of that? We work in coalitions to do the work that we do. And one of the members of the coalitions that we work with is the Food Chain Workers Alliance. As you know, without farm laborers, the agricultural system doesn't work. You can list all of the blinking lights and GMOs and drones and high tech that you want. Without farm laborers, farms don't work. Dairyers don't work. Meat packers don't work. Nobody serves you your food, cleans the dishes, washes up after you. That's just in agriculture. We're not talking about construction and road work and everything else that these laborers, particularly immigrant laborers, enable. But agriculture wouldn't work, period. And when you ask them what they want science to investigate, top of the list is we're exposed to some of the deadliest chemicals that there are in the course of doing our daily work in the fields. Is there a way that we can do that work without endangering our own health and the health of our children through birth defects? And of course, I believe there's lots of ways of farming sustainably. It's not a matter of my belief. There's lots of ways that you could farm sustainably. One of the ways in which you can answer that question is through organic agriculture, figuring out ways in which you can control weeds and pests and be productive without the utilization of noxious chemicals that will endanger the human beings that we're sending out there in order to perform the manual labor that's required. And actually, that's particularly a responsibility in organic systems for lots of reasons. I'll get to it in just a little bit. We tend to substitute toxic chemicals that we utilize in organic systems as well, and we rely more on human labor, say for weed control and those systems, particularly for horticultural purposes. Okay, so let's talk about agriculture or agroecology as an alternative to everything that I've just described and how we might have done this differently. So the example comes from natural prairie. In this part of the world, that's the example I'm going to use. If you patterned an agricultural system according to the structure of ecological systems around you, you would see something like this. Biodiversity, and rather than that monolithic canopy that you saw earlier on, you would see different layers of leaves with different capacities to take advantage of different intensity of radiation. So the top layer would take advantage of very intense radiation. You'd have thick, broad leaves down at the bottom on the surface of the soil. It would know what to do with what agronomists refer to as the red light that reaches the bottom of the canopy. So it would look something like that. And like that's a South American version of this. I will only tell you about these sorts of systems that in the very best examples that have been determined by native science, empirical science, you can get productivity per unit of land that is 6 times the productivity that you would get from the monocrops because of complementarity, because crops don't compete with each other even though they're sharing the same piece of land. That's the insight for how these polycultural systems work. And we know a lot from traditional practices, but we don't know as much as we could know because we haven't asked the question, how can we invest in polycultural systems? So in polycultural systems, there would be greater return to management and to knowledge. Someone managing a polycultural or an agroecological system, and I'm just showing you some examples of folks that are attempting to do research in these sorts of systems, would actually get greater return to their knowledge. And when they went out on their farms, what they would see when they looked out over the extension of their farm is information that would tell them where the water is pooled right now, where the nitrogen is pooled right now. They would be thinking about what organisms they need to manage and stoke in the soil to convert the nitrogen into usable nitrogen. They would know about the organic matter in the soil, where they need to increase it, decrease it. They would be thinking about the earthworm population, what those earthworms are doing to process the material that's being incorporated into the soil and turn it into carbon and to help stabilize structure in the soil and so on. They would think that way, and their return would be to that and not so much to stuff that they're buying off the farm. And there's one of the reasons why there hasn't been so much investment in this, particularly when you go back to that Stu Smith Structure of Agriculture cartoon that I keep repeating. This would be much more profitable for farmers, as research such as this conducted at Iowa State demonstrates. These are the Marsden rotational studies for those of you that follow that sort of stuff. And there's not much profit for it in the industry because they can't sell you as much. And remember, who's determining our agricultural policies? So those agricultural policies began with a very sordid history. You saw a recognition in your program for whose land we're on right now. Today's Congress would not have chosen this name for this particular act. They would have gone with something like the Native American New Opportunities and Jobs Act. But the 1830 Congress was very direct about what they intended to do. And that campaign lasted for 50 years, the 1830s through the 1880s, and the consummation of the Sioux and Apache wars. And then supposedly folks were given stolen land. And for folks today believe that their century and older farms are places where they pick themselves up by their bootstraps, not failing to recognize you're just not getting free land anymore to build your wealth, one of the key factors of production. And I'm not going to go through each of these in essence, but very soon with government support, and namely through investments and understanding the science, through the land grant investments, through the extension service, through direct subsidies, and through trying to create alternative markets for the surpluses, the problem soon began: how do we create trash cans for the surplus that we're producing? So the School Lunch Act was a trash can, the SNAP program is a trash can, bioplastics are a trash can, ethanol is a trash can. What can we do with all of this excess stuff that we're producing? Now, I just want to point this out without going into details of this, that these are all decisions that are being made by the legislature of the land. And it is enough to make the argument about what would be better than this. And so I'm going to recite to you insights from a journal paper that you can look at in this citation. But essentially the insights go like this. In the industrial system, there is something that is referred to as sustainable intensification. It's perfectly fine. It's an argument for efficiency. As long as you're using nitrogen fertilizer, make sure you don't waste that. You paid for it, so make sure you get a return on it. You know, I keep going on sidelines here. It doesn't really work with farmers. The cost of nitrogen is so little compared to the insurance that it provides that you're going to make the top level yield for all the other investment you can make it, that they are willing to waste 2/3 of it. Literally, that's what we found. 1/2 to 2/3 of it in order to make sure that they're not limited by nitrogen. So that argument doesn't really work. But anyway, that's the sustainable intensification argument. And so I'm going to describe to you 5 levels of evolution to agroecological systems that begin with that sustainable intensification, which we should support. It would mean less waste and pollution of the environment. Level number 2 is the organic system. Great, we should support it. in general, monocultures that you are going to just replace inputs for, find some natural input for some chemically synthesized input. Fine, it's a great thing. But once you start incorporating biodiversity into the system, you get more into the sophistication that actually makes plenty rather than scarcity out of plenty. You begin to have trophic interactions. Those are the things that keep pest controls and weeds under control. And there's a fourth level, which is the one that involves society supporting that system. Not just the policies that individual corporations want, but the society as a whole saying, we value the cleanliness of the environment, we value rural communities, we value farmers out on the land, and we're going to support a system that supports all of that. And then there's the fifth system that involves actually creating the policies that create the armature for all of that to exist, just exactly the same way that we've created the policies, as I hope I've demonstrated, for the kind of system that we have right now. Can't bring myself to update this presidential picture here. So let me show you a picture of the investments that we make in agroecological research right now. You can sort of ignore the left, which is just to show you the size of the pie of the USDA budget. The punchline is over to the right. So the major source of competitive research grants for folks doing science and institutions like the one that we're at is the National Institute for Food and Agriculture. It has a budget of $294 million. So we asked the question, how much of that is advancing sustainable agriculture? That's about $203 million. And as you go through each one of those levels that I just described to you, it turns out that when you put all of this into percentages, only 3% of NIFA's investments will support those of you sitting out in the audience that want a level 5 transformation of agricultural systems, where you're not displacing farmers, where you're not exploiting nature, not exploiting people, not denuding the economy of rural communities, and not producing food that's going to make us sick. You get what you invest in, and you don't get what you don't invest in. And so our major work at the Unit of Concerned Scientists, aside from being very frustrated with that state of events, is to actually advocate for the kind of a system that we just described. And I'm getting the signal here that we need to cut it out. But you know that here in Wisconsin, you have one of the most successful examples of how to counter the weakness of this particular model that I've just described by simply making the observation that farmers are so devalued here that they have no actual agency, no negotiating power. They have to accept whatever price is given. And so controlling supply, identifying the value of what they're producing, and negotiating for price collectively is the key insight, the key mechanism of a cooperative like Organic Valley, which should become more of a model for more and more farmers. That actually has a complex history. It's not like others haven't thought about it, haven't tried to do it. I need to come back other times. We can have that conversation. But I can tell you that in Iowa, we've actually done a study to determine what is the size of the food market, and then ask, of that market, how much of that could be produced by Iowa farmers? We developed this on data that was collected by the Leopold Center for Sustainable Agriculture and then took it to the next level. And what we determined was that we would be able to support about 8,500 farms that otherwise would disappear. They would be on the left-hand side of that chart that Secretary Vilsack was talking about. If only 50% of the institutional purchasing in the state of Iowa would purchase the food that Iowan farmers can produce. Obviously, they're not going to compete for bananas and coffee and things of that sort, but of the kinds of food that Iowa farmers can produce. And in addition to that, that would add up to 89,000 farm-related jobs, and it would be worth about $830 million to the rural economy of the state of Iowa, money that would stay in the state of Iowa. I'm sure we can repeat this in many of the states of the Midwest. Again, it's an example of valuing different things and just reconfiguring the assets and realizing we're the market that can help to fix some of the deficiencies that exist in the current structure of agriculture. Now, because I'm getting the high sign that we need to go here, I'll just very quickly summarize that there are purchasing programs that we are joining with many in coalition to try to get implemented all over the country. So this is the Good Food Purchasing Policy. You see 5 different values that are listed there. And here the genius of this particular system is to say something like this, to say the University of Wisconsin-Madison or any large institutional purchaser program was created by the city of Los Angeles originally, and they applied it to vendors that sold more than $1 million of food into the city. And they said to them, if you want to get this $1 million contract, you need to show us that you have a plan that you are going to produce in such a way that your food is local, it's sustainable, it's fair, it's healthy, and it's humane. And they gave them an entry pathway, 5 different stages for each of those categories, 25 stars, which they call LEED certification for food. And they've got measures of the improvement in healthy food access for school children in the terms of water that they've saved, in terms of improved benefits to truckers and union members that deliver this food to schools, and so on. The genius of this is that you don't have to say, we need a new federal program or we need new dollars. These dollars are already being spent by institutional purchasers. They can multiply the benefit of spending those dollars 5 times by just saying, we're only going to spend those dollars when they support these values. We've talked actually to the city of Madison about this program, but it's been implemented in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Oakland, city of Chicago, Cook County, the county around the city of Chicago, Cincinnati's in conversations at the moment, Austin's in conversations at the moment, and so on. Now, I mentioned earlier that we're doing this work in coalition. That is not only because there's only 12 of us on my team. We can't do a whole lot by ourselves, even though those are 12 very brilliant people. We have to work in coalitions. But more importantly, for the very first thing I said to you this evening, science is inherently a human activity. It's a subjective activity. You find out what you want to know, and we haven't been asking key people what science needs to be doing for social well-being rather than for corporate profit. And saying that, I want to be really clear. The food system is in the private sector. That is the food system. It isn't that they should not have a voice or a role. They produce, they process, they distribute, and so on. It's just that right now they're the only voice, they're the dominant voice, and nobody else gets a say. So the coalitions that we're working with are the HEAL Food Alliance, Health, Environment, Agriculture, Labor, primarily grassroots organizations, people of color, the descendants of people who were displaced from their land, enslaved for their labor, or whose labor currently is undervalued, and asking them, what do you want science to do in order to create a better food system for you folks? Another coalition that's called Good Food for All. Here's an example of a visit with Representative Jim McGovern in March of this year. And I can't resist showing you this particular illustration just of last week of prominent scientists from all around the country that we had come in and advocate to Congress, specifically for the Farm Bill that is being debated this week and next. So that we would get more investment in agroecological research. And many of you will recognize the eminent Dr. Alfonso Morales up front and center there. So with that, I want to conclude, and probably for the 5th time, and I think it bears that sort of repetition, remind you of the fact, if you are a scientist, you're not just doing science. I would call your attention to the example of the Google employees who recently rebelled against their leadership and said that they either would quit, and many of them did, or they wanted the company to stop supporting the Pentagon's research on Project Maven, which is essentially artificial intelligence for war purposes. The key thing that they objected to was that they didn't know what the Department of Defense was asking them to do. They were just doing individual fragmented products, and they didn't know what their science and their research was going to add it up to. Land-grant university scientists ought to be doing that sort of thing, asking, what is this thing that I'm doing right now? Even if it seems aseptic, even if it seems valueless, I hope, if I've made no other point, there is no such thing as objectivity, no such thing as valueless scientific conduct, and we need to be eminently aware of that and act upon that. Thanks for coming.